In 1922, when the archaeologist Howard Carter finally broke through the sealed doorway of a teenage pharaoh's tomb, a burial chamber that had sat undisturbed for more than 3,000 years, he found gold funerary masks, ceremonial chariots, and jewelry fit for a god. He also found licorice root. Packed away among King Tutankhamun's treasures, alongside everything a pharaoh supposedly needed for eternity, sat a plain, twisted, dark brown root, the kind you could buy today from a gas station checkout counter for less than $1. Not gold, not lapis lazuli, a root. Whoever prepared that tomb believed the young king needed it in the next world as badly as he needed his crown. That is the detail worth sitting with. A modern snack sealed in stone next to solid gold, 3,000 years before anyone thought to sell it in a wrapper. It tells you something that a king took this to his grave. The same root that once sat beside solid gold, wrapped for eternity, now retails for pocket change, a few cents an ounce, scooped from open bins at ordinary grocery stores, no ceremony required. A pharaoh needed a priesthood and a sealed tomb to keep his. You just need a checkout line. Licorice was never just a flavor. It has always stood on the line between medicine and poison, sweetness and death. So how did a wild shrub growing along riverbanks and open steppe end up traveling with armies, funding monasteries, and eventually printed on a modern warning label? How did something a pharaoh trusted with his own afterlife end up regulated by health agencies 4,000 years later? This story starts in soil scattered from the banks of the Nile to the steppes of Central Asia to the river valleys of China, in places that had never traded with each other at all. Egyptian physicians ground the root into a sweet drink they called maïsouz, and historians believe Tutankhamun wanted that drink waiting for him on the other side. That same drink never actually disappeared. Even today, the dried root is rinsed, dusted with a little baking soda, and left to rest for hours before it is finally simmered and strained. Walk through Cairo during the holy month of Ramadan, and you can still find street vendors carrying heavy copper urns strapped across their chests, cymbals clinking to announce them, tilting the urn low to pour a cold, dark brown licorice drink called suuz into a glass, foaming it up on purpose as it falls from that height. People break their fast with it for the same reason Egyptian soldiers reportedly drank it thousands of years earlier, because it is believed to fight thirst and settle the stomach. That is not a revival act for tourists. That is one recipe, essentially unbroken, for roughly 4,000 years. Thousands of miles east, Chinese physicians were reaching for the exact same root, independently, and arriving at nearly the same reverence. By around 200 CE, it appears in the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica, one of the oldest surviving pharmacies in the written world, listed among the superior herbs. No one told them to. Chinese doctors gave it an honorific title, Guo Lao, which translates roughly to the nation's teacher, because they believed it calmed and balanced the harsher medicines it was blended with, the way a wise elder settles an argument between younger voices. In Greece, the physician and botanist Theophrastus wrote about the same root in the 3rd century BCE, and he did not even have a name for it at first. Not yet, anyway. He called it Scythian root, borrowed from the Scythians, nomadic horsemen who rode the open plains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Different empire, same root. Assyrian and Indian medical traditions record it too, each independently, and ancient Hindu physicians reportedly prepared it with milk and sugar, believing it restored vigor and strength. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains almost everything that follows. Licorice root does not need centuries of processing to taste good. Pulled straight from the ground and chewed raw, It is already intensely sweet, by weight, far sweeter than sugarcane. The compound responsible, glycyrrhizin, is roughly 50 times sweeter than ordinary table sugar, gram for gram. In a world with no refined sugar, that single fact, a wild plant handing out real sweetness for free, is most of the reason so many unconnected civilizations all decided this plant was worth keeping. It was not a bitter root people learned to tolerate over generations, the way coffee or tobacco had to be acquired. It was closer to finding candy already growing wild in the dirt, disguised as a roadside weed. A discovery like that does not stay buried. It gets carried. According to legend, and it is only legend, no surviving order or letter confirms it, Alexander the Great had his soldiers carry licorice root with them on the long marches through Persia and into India, chewing it to fight thirst across the driest stretches of the campaign. Whether or not that particular story is true, licorice genuinely did become standard kit for ancient armies. Roman and Greek soldiers chewed the root on the march, believing it curbed hunger and eased the need for water en route, where water itself was the scarcest resource of all. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder recommended it specifically for strengthening the voice and quieting hunger pangs, and physicians across the Mediterranean prescribed it for coughs, sore throats, and upset stomachs. This was not a treat passed around for morale on a hard day. It traveled in a soldier's kit next to his weapons, wrapped and dried, pulled out and gnawed on during the long, dust-choked hours between marches, as functional as a blade or a canteen, something reached for out of necessity, not indulgence. The habit outlasted every empire that carried it. Centuries later, long after Rome had fallen, Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly kept the same habit alive, chewing licorice root constantly, a small echo of legions that had marched more than 1,000 years before him. This seemed like a small detail of ancient logistics. It was not. Armies do not only carry supplies, they carry habits. And everywhere Roman legions marched, they left the custom of chewing this root behind them, planted in garrison towns from North Africa to the edge of Britain. By the time the empire had crumbled, licorice was already stitched into the medical tradition of half of Europe, quietly waiting for its next chapter to begin. That next chapter took root, almost literally, in the damp, loamy soil of Yorkshire, England. Sometime around the 1300s, licorice began growing in the fields, surrounding a fortress called Pontefract Castle. Nobody wrote down exactly how it arrived. Local legend credits either knights returning from the Crusades or Dominican monks who had settled at a nearby priory, monks who would have known the plant from their travels around the Mediterranean and possibly from Spain, where the local dialect still calls licorice Spanish to this day. What is certain is that the soil around Pontefract, sandy, deep and rich, sitting over magnesian limestone, was ideal for a root that can stretch 4 to 5 feet underground before it stops, tangled beneath leafy bushes that could grow taller than a person. Monks cultivated it as medicine, extracting the sap to treat coughs and stomach complaints, the same uses Roman physicians had recorded more than 1,000 years before them. By the 1600s, the English herbalist Nicholas Culpeper was recording licorice in his own writings, noting it was planted across fields and gardens throughout the country, already a familiar, profitable crop, rather than an exotic import. Around the same period, the English carried the plant across the ocean too. In the 16th century, a colonist named John Josselyn listed licorice among the precious herbs he brought from England to Boston, brewing it into a beer, along with aniseed, fennel, and sassafras, to treat local settlers and Native Americans suffering from bad colds. For nearly 3 centuries, licorice in Pontefract stayed exactly that: medicine, grown in monastery gardens under a royal decree that protected local growers, with something close to a national monopoly, sold as raw, bitter lumps. Then, in 1614, a local landowner named Sir George Savile began pressing small, hardened discs of pure licorice extract and stamping them by hand with an official seal bearing the image of the castle, so buyers would know they came from Pontefract. These stamped medicinal lozenges became known as Pontefract cakes, and for roughly 150 years, that is all they were: unpleasant medicine with a castle logo pressed into the top, sold by weight in apothecary shops. This seemed like the end of the story. It was not. In 1760, a local apothecary named George Dunhill did something almost embarrassingly simple. He mixed sugar into the licorice paste. What had been a lozenge taken out of necessity became a candy taken out of desire. One ingredient and licorice crossed a line. It would never cross back again. Word of that shift traveled fast, and the whole region turned it into an industry. By the 1700s, entire fields around Pontefract Castle, even the old castle yard itself, had become licorice gardens. At its peak in the early 20th century, the town held 17 separate licorice factories, together stamping out roughly 25,000 cakes a day, each one still pressed by hand. The workers who did the stamping were literally called thumpers, and a skilled thumper could press out 20,000 cakes in a single shift. In Italy, meanwhile, the Amarelli family had already been trading licorice root since around the year 1500, and by 1731, Giorgio Amarelli had opened a dedicated factory to press the extract into solid blocks, turning a family trade into a genuine mass product, one that is still running under the same name today. The industry that had grown from those fields could not last on English soil forever. Licorice root needs roughly 5 years in Pontefract's cooler climate to reach full size, compared to 2 or 3 years in warmer countries like Spain, Italy, and Turkey. Once cheaper, faster-growing imported root became available. The economics turned against the very town that had built its name on the plant. The last commercial licorice harvest in Pontefract took place in 1966. Today, the fields are gone, the factories have shrunk to a handful, and the root inside every modern Pontefract cake is imported from the same warmer countries that once learned the craft from England in the first place. But the moment that proved licorice candy could sell itself almost by accident happened in 1899 in the English city of Leicester. A traveling salesman for the Bassett's Confectionery Company, a man named Charlie Thompson, was pitching his individual licorice sweets, chips, rocks, buttons, and twists to a wholesaler who was not buying any of them. Fumbling to gather his sample tray, Thompson dropped it, scattering the whole colorful assortment across the counter in a jumbled heap. The wholesaler looked at the mess sitting in front of him and placed an order on the spot, not for the individual sweets, but for the mixture itself. Liquorice Allsorts, still one of Britain's most recognized candies, exists because of a clumsy accident that nobody planned, asked for, or could have designed on purpose. The company later gave the candy its own mascot, a cheerful little man built entirely out of Licorice Allsorts pieces, named Bertie Bassett, introduced in 1926 and still recognized in British shops a century later. Across the Atlantic, America was quietly building a licorice dynasty of its own. In 1845, in Brooklyn, New York, 2 brothers and a business partner opened a candy shop under the name Young and Smiley, specializing in licorice sweets. In 1902, that company merged with 2 smaller rivals to form the National Licorice Company, and in 1929, right as the stock market was collapsing into the Great Depression, the company twisted its licorice paste into long ropes and gave them a name, Twizzlers, renamed Y&S Candies in 1968 and bought outright by Hershey in 1977, Twizzlers is now the best-selling licorice candy in the United States, standing alongside Good and Plenty, a pink and white capsule candy that has been made without interruption since 1893. By the 20th century, licorice had quietly worked its way into places that had nothing to do with candy at all. Its natural foaming compounds, called saponins, were mixed with baking soda and aluminum sulfate inside early chemical fire extinguishers, stabilizing the foam that smothered flames before modern extinguishers existed. That same foaming trick is part of why a well-poured pint of Guinness still carries its thick, creamy head today. The plant that once rode in a soldier's kit was now hiding inside a firefighter's tank and settling on top of a bartender's pour, unnoticed and unread on any label, doing quiet chemical work nobody thanks it for. It also became a standard flavoring in the tobacco industry, sweetening chewing tobacco and cigarette blends for over a century, meaning generations of smokers who never once bought a bag of black licorice were still tasting it with every pack. And here is a strange twist worth pausing on. Much of what modern Americans call licorice candy contains no licorice at all. Many products simply use anise oil, which smells and tastes almost identical, meaning millions of people have spent their whole lives eating something named after a plant they have never actually tasted. The same root the Egyptians once brewed into maïzous and the Romans chewed for a sore throat still shows up, quietly, in modern medicine cabinets. Licorice extract remains a common ingredient in throat lozenges and cough syrup sold on pharmacy shelves today, marketed for exactly the same soothing effect Pliny the Elder described 2,000 years ago, just repackaged in foil instead of a soldier's pouch. But the same appetite that built candy empires and stocked pharmacies eventually turned against the plant itself. Licorice is not only harvested in China, it is deliberately planted there. Its deep, tangled root system used for decades to hold loose sand in place and slow the creeping spread of desertification across the country's arid northwest. Today, China cultivates licorice across more than 74,000 acres of land and consumes over 60,000 tons of it every single year for medicine, food, and industry combined. And that number has only grown since licorice root, still called gangcao, was included in China's official treatment protocols during the COVID-19 pandemic. The same honored plant from the Divine Farmer's Classic pressed back into service 2,000 years later. The demand has grown so large that wild licorice, still growing free along the old Silk Road routes through China and neighboring Kazakhstan, is being pulled out of the ground faster than it can regrow. A conservation report on Kazakhstan's wild root trade has warned that this overharvesting is degrading the very steppes and riverbanks the plant is supposed to protect from erosion and flooding. The plant once trusted to hold back the desert is now being stripped out of the exact soil it was meant to save, an irony nobody was chasing on purpose. The modern industry has, in its own way, learned to work around the risk. Licorice root sold today as a dietary supplement is often stripped of glycyrrhizin entirely, labeled deglycyrrhizinated licorice, keeping the plant's traditional stomach-soothing reputation while removing the ingredient capable of causing harm. Regulators have drawn their own uneven lines around what remains. The European Union caps daily glycyrrhizin intake at 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, while the FDA classifies licorice extract as generally recognized as safe, yet still requires warning language on high-potency products. An uneasy compromise for a plant whose reputation has swung between cure and hazard for 4,000 years. Pay attention to this final detail, because it closes the loop this whole story opened in a pharaoh's tomb. In 2017, the FDA issued a formal warning that adults over the age of 40 who eat 2 ounces of black licorice a day for 2 weeks or more risk developing an irregular heart rhythm, because the compound that gives licorice its sweetness, glycyrrhizin, can quietly drain the body's potassium. When potassium falls far enough, it can bring high blood pressure, swelling, lethargy, and in the worst cases, congestive heart failure. Most people recover once they stop eating it. Not everyone does. In 2020, the New England Journal of Medicine published the case of a Massachusetts man in his 50s who had been eating 1 to 2 bags of black licorice candy every single day. His potassium level fell to less than half of normal. He collapsed at a fast food restaurant and died within 24 hours. The same route once trusted to accompany a king into the afterlife had, on its own, become powerful enough to end a modern one. No army, empire, or accident required. Look at the distance this route has traveled. It went from a sealed burial chamber in Egypt to a soldier's ration on the road to Persia, from a monk's medicine garden in Yorkshire to a stamped, hand-thumped lozenge, from a spilled sample tray in Leicester to a candy rack in every American movie theater, from a firefighter's extinguisher to a pint glass, to, in the end, a hospital bed, and it is still poured hot and foaming from a copper urn on the streets of Cairo every single evening during Ramadan. It became a cure, then a comfort, then an industry, then, on occasion, a warning label. Licorice was never just a flavor. It has always stood on the line between medicine and poison, sweetness and death. The next time you unwrap a piece of black licorice, you are not only tasting candy, you are tasting 4,000 years of exactly that tension. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us which part surprised you the most, and smash that like button so more people can find it. There are more videos like this one coming.